The year is 1888, the Dakota Territory. Outside, the world has ceased to be a place for the living. The wind does not merely blow, it screams with the voice of shattered glass, driving a blinding horizontal wall of snow across the plains. It is the Great White Hurricane, an apocalyptic Arctic front that has descended without warning. The temperature has plummeted to 34 degrees below zero. Out on the high ridge, where the grand estates and towering mansions of the railroad tycoons and the banking syndicate stand as monuments to human vanity, panic has finally broken through the veneer of civilized wealth. Cornelius Vance, the chief financier of the Territorial Bank, stands shivering violently in the center of his opulent parlor. He is wrapped in 3 layers of imported Scottish wool, yet his breath turns to thick white vapor inside his own drawing room. The grand, ornate cast-iron stove, imported from Chicago at the staggering cost of $350, sits dead and cold. It is an iron stomach that demands constant, insatiable feeding, and the coal trains have been trapped under 20 feet of snow for 5 days. The heavy metal, which only yesterday radiated a fierce, skin-drying heat, now acts as a conductor of creeping death, pulling the outside frost directly into the house. Ice creeps up the inside of the glass windows, forming jagged, crystalline daggers. Mr. Vance's hands, once soft, manicured, and used only to counting paper bills and signing foreclosure deeds, are now blue and trembling as he desperately tries to snap the leg off a carved mahogany dining chair to use as kindling. He is discovering, with profound and terrifying clarity, that a mountain of gold cannot create a single spark of warmth when the earth turns its face away. But 3 miles away, at the bottom of the valley, where the wind howls like a wounded beast against a small, half-buried cabin, there is silence. Not the silence of death, but the profound, breathing silence of absolute safety. Inside this humble, shadowy dwelling, the air is thick, golden, and overwhelmingly warm. The temperature hangs at a steady, luxurious 70 degrees. A 16-year-old girl named Anya sits in a wooden rocking chair, her bare feet resting comfortably against the floorboards. In her lap sleeps her 6-year-old brother, Tobias. His chest rises and falls in the deep, untroubled rhythm of a child who knows no fear. Tobias was born with lungs as fragile as spun sugar. A single night in the freezing drafts of a standard pioneer cabin would have taken him from this world forever. Yet, here he sleeps, bathed in a gentle, radiating heat that feels like the memory of a summer sun. There is no roaring fire in the room. There is no pile of expensive anthracite coal. There is no $350 iron monster devouring their meager resources. Instead, spanning the entire back wall of the cabin is a massive, curved structure of earth and clay, smooth river stones, and repurposed ceramic pipes. It looks less like a chimney and more like the spine of a sleeping giant, molded directly into the architecture of the home. This wall is entirely warm to the touch. It is alive with captured energy. 14 hours ago, Anya burned a small bundle of dry pine scrap and birch twigs, fuel that cost her absolutely nothing. The fire burned fast and hot for just 1 hour and then went out. And yet, the wall has been radiating a massive, unbroken wave of thermal comfort ever since. How is this possible? How does a 16-year-old orphan, armed with nothing but mud, rocks, and a few discarded drain pipes, a system built for a grand total of $2.40, survive an apocalyptic freeze that is bringing the wealthiest men in the territory to their knees? The answer lies not in the arrogance of modern industry, but in the forgotten wisdom of the earth. The men on the hill built their empires by extracting wealth, assuming they could simply buy their way out of nature's wrath. They believed in the brute force of combustion. Burn the fuel, feel the sudden heat. Let the smoke escape straight up into the sky. But Anya did not fight the nature of fire. She listened to it. She understood a fundamental truth of physics that the men in their tailored suits had mocked. Smoke is not just waste. Smoke is thermal energy. Smoke is life. And if you know how to build a labyrinth for it, it will leave its warmth behind before it departs into the night. To understand the miracle of this breathing wall, and to witness the profound poetic justice that is about to unfold as the freezing elite are forced to walk through the snow to beg for shelter from the girl they once humiliated, we must go back. We must return to the golden days of autumn, when the air was still forgiving, and the arrogance of the banking syndicate was at its peak. 6 months ago, Anya was nothing but a shadow on the edge of the thriving settlement. Left entirely alone to care for little Tobias after a swift fever took their parents, she faced a mathematically impossible equation. The winter was coming. The railroad had inflated the price of coal to $40 a week, a sum she could not earn in 2 years of scrubbing floors at the bank. The timber in the valley had been clear-cut by the mining companies, leaving only spindly brush and fast-burning softwoods. Anya knew what the cold did to the poor. She had seen the frozen earth swallow entire families who had trusted in flimsy tin stoves and the empty promises of merchants. She knew that if she built a standard chimney, a straight vertical shaft to vent the smoke of whatever meager twigs she could gather, 80% of the heat would rush straight up into the freezing sky. She would be feeding the clouds while her brother shivered on the floor. She needed a miracle, but miracles, she had learned, are not handed down by the wealthy. They are dug from the dirt with blistered hands. Before we witness the construction of this masterpiece of low-tech engineering, and before we watch the architects of greed freeze in the shadow of their own ignorance, I ask you to join our circle around the fire. If you believe that true wealth lies in the wisdom of our ancestors and not in the bank accounts of the elite, subscribe to this channel. Leave a like to keep this hearth burning, and share this knowledge with those who understand that the old ways still hold the key to our survival. And tell me, from which city are you watching this story unfold? Write it below so we know how far our tribe extends across the map. The autumn of 1888 arrived in the Dakota Territory not as a gentle transition, but as a stern warning. The mornings brought a brittle, white frost that clung to the wild prairie grass, and the wind carried the faint, metallic scent of snow from the northern peaks. In the booming railroad town of Oak Haven, October was the season of panic and purchasing. For the banking syndicate and the railway barons, winter was merely another problem to be solved with a checkbook. Down at the train depot, heavy wooden crates were being unloaded by sweating laborers. Inside these crates were the newly patented, ornate cast-iron parlor stoves imported straight from Chicago. They were massive, black, claw-footed beasts of industry, adorned with polished nickel trim and stamped with the names of wealthy foundries. Cornelius Vance, the chief financier, stood on the loading dock, watching his new prize being hoisted onto a wagon. He had paid $350 for it, a staggering fortune that a common laborer could not earn in a lifetime. To feed these iron stomachs, the elite had established an endless supply line of premium anthracite coal, brought in by the rail cars. At $40 a week, it was a king's ransom just to keep the fires burning. But Vance and his peers believed in the absolute supremacy of modern engineering. They believed that fire was a brute force transaction. You pack the iron belly with black rock, you ignite it, and it violently blasts heat into the room while vomiting a massive plume of black smoke straight up a tin pipe and out into the freezing sky. It was inefficient, aggressive, and entirely dependent on a fragile supply chain, but to the men in tailored suits, it was the ultimate symbol of progress. For 16-year-old Anya, progress looked very different. Progress was simply making it to tomorrow. Anya possessed exactly $2.40 to her name. She earned her meager coins by scrubbing the polished mahogany floors of Vance's bank on her hands and knees, working long after the tellers had gone home. Every penny went to purchasing oats, root vegetables, and the occasional bottle of eucalyptus oil for 6-year-old Tobias. The boy's lungs rattled with a terrifying wet cough every time the temperature dropped. Their home was a neglected, drafty homesteader's cabin on the undesirable marshy edge of town, where the wind hit the hardest. A standard wood stove was an impossible dream. Even a cheap sheet metal box cost $20, and it would devour wood faster than Anya could chop it. Furthermore, a thin metal stove offers only convective heat. It warms the air, not the objects in the room. The moment the fire dies, the metal goes cold, and the freezing drafts instantly reclaim the space. For little Tobias, an extinguished fire in the middle of the night meant a death sentence. Anya knew she could not fight the winter with money. She had to fight it with mass. She remembered the stories her grandfather used to whisper before he passed, tales of the brutal winters in the old country, of massive stone ovens that occupied half the house, systems that captured the soul of the fire and held it close. She didn't have bricks, and she didn't have mortar, but she had the earth, and she noticed what the bank was throwing away. Behind the grand stone edifice of the Territorial Bank, a massive trench had been dug for a new, modern plumbing system. Scattered around the dirt were dozens of heavy, cracked terracotta drain pipes, pieces deemed too damaged to carry water, discarded as useless garbage. To the bankers, it was refuse. To Anya, it was the circulatory system of a beast she was about to build. On a biting Tuesday afternoon, Anya was struggling in the alley behind the bank. She had fashioned a crude sled from broken shipping pallets and was heavily loading it with the cracked clay pipes, large field stones she had hauled from the riverbed, and buckets of thick, heavy clay mud mixed with dry prairie grass. Her hands were raw, bleeding at the knuckles, and her old boots were soaked through with freezing mud. She was panting, her breath pluming in the cold air, her small frame straining against the immense, dead weight of the earth she was trying to drag. "Well now, what in heaven's name is this pathetic display?" The voice was smooth, dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who has never known physical labor. Anya froze. Standing at the back entrance of the bank, smoking a thick imported cigar, was Cornelius Vance. Beside him stood his chief architect and engineer, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Grimes, holding a roll of blueprints. They looked down at Anya's sled of mud and broken pipes as if they were looking at a diseased animal. "I am taking the broken pipes, Mr. Vance," Anya said quietly, keeping her eyes lowered to the frozen dirt. "They were in the discard pile. I need them for my chimney." Grimes, the engineer, let out a loud, scoffing laugh. He stepped closer, nudging one of the cracked terracotta tubes with his polished leather boot. "A chimney? Out of drain pipes and river mud? Girl, you are more ignorant than you look. Clay cracks under direct flame. And these are angled joints. How do you intend to stack these? They won't form a straight vertical line." "I am not going to build a straight vertical line, sir," Anya replied, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the freezing wind. "I am going to build a maze inside my wall. I will run the smoke sideways, back and forth, through the pipes. The clay and the stone will trap the heat of the smoke before it leaves the house." The silence that followed was heavy. Then Vance and Grimes erupted into booming, condescending laughter. It was the kind of laughter that echoed off the brick walls, designed to shrink the soul of the person hearing it. Grimes wiped a tear of mirth from his eye and pointed his blueprint at her like a weapon. "A horizontal chimney? You are a fool, girl. You are a dangerous, uneducated fool. Let me teach you a basic law of thermodynamics, since clearly your peasant parents failed to do so. A chimney relies entirely on draft. Draft requires a straight, vertical column of rapidly ascending hot air. Heat rises. If you put right angles in a flue, if you force the smoke to travel horizontally through a cold, damp maze of mud, the smoke will hit a wall. It will stall. It will lose its buoyancy, choke the fire, and reverse its flow." Grimes leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "You are going to fill your miserable little shack with carbon monoxide. You won't freeze, girl. You'll suffocate in your sleep. You are building a tomb of carbon for yourself and that sickly brother of yours." Vance puffed on his cigar, letting the fragrant, expensive smoke drift into Anya's face. "The engineer speaks the truth, Anya. You cannot cheat the laws of physics, and you cannot cheat poverty with mud. If you cannot afford the $40 for coal to heat your home properly, perhaps you should do the merciful thing. Surrender the boy to the territorial orphanage. At least they have a boiler. We can't have you freezing to death on the edge of town. It's terribly bad for property values." The humiliation burned hotter than any fire. They were attacking her mind, her desperate poverty, and her love for her brother, all at once. The engineer's words were terrifyingly precise. He was a man of science, an educated architect. What if he was right? What if she built this labyrinth, and it only served to poison the only family she had left? But as Anya looked at their smug, powdered faces, she realized something profound. These men only knew how to buy heat. They only knew the violent, artificial combustion of iron and coal. They did not understand the quiet, enduring memory of the earth. They did not know that smoke, if coaxed gently rather than forced, will follow the path of least resistance. Anya did not argue. She did not beg for their understanding, nor did she cry. The wisdom of the humble does not need to justify itself to the arrogance of the elite. She simply gripped the frayed ropes of her makeshift sled, her knuckles white, leaned her weight forward, and began the agonizingly slow drag back to the valley. Behind her, the bankers returned to the warmth of their massive, iron-guzzling stoves, secure in their belief that money had conquered nature. They had no idea that in less than 2 months the sky would fall, the iron would betray them, and the very physics they used to mock a vulnerable teenage girl would become the instrument of their profound and freezing ruin. The wind howling across the Dakota plains carried the bitter promise of the incoming freeze, rattling the thin wooden planks of Anya's cabin. Inside, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, 6-year-old Tobias coughed, a hollow, rattling sound that struck Anya's heart like a physical blow. Time was running out. The earth was hardening. If she did not finish her work before the ground froze solid, they would not survive the winter. Anya stood in the center of her small, single-room home, looking at the pile of scavenged materials she had dragged through the mud. A mound of cracked terracotta drain pipes, a pile of dense blue river clay, sacks of dry prairie grass, and heavy, round field stones. Her total financial investment in this survival system was exactly $2.40, the price of a small, salvaged cast-iron firebox door and a few metal brackets she had bought from the blacksmith's scrap pile. Up on the ridge, in the sprawling gas-lit mansions, the bankers were finalizing the installation of their $350 iron stoves. They were signing weekly contracts of $40 for premium coal. They were buying survival at a premium, blind to the fact that they were purchasing an illusion of security. An iron stove relies entirely on convective heat. It violently heats the air, but air has virtually no mass. It cannot hold thermal energy. The moment the fire in an iron stove dies, the hot air rises, escapes through the roof and the floorboards, and the freezing drafts instantly reclaim the room. The iron becomes a block of ice. The bankers were not storing heat. They were merely renting it, minute by minute, at an exorbitant price. Anya, however, was about to build a thermal battery. She was employing a principle as old as the Earth itself, a law of physics known as thermal inertia. She began at the floor, against the back wall of the cabin. A thermal mass heater weighs thousands of pounds, and the freezing ground would steal its heat if not properly insulated. She laid down a foundation of empty glass bottles, scavenged from the town's tavern, packing the spaces between them with dry wood ash and pumice stone. This created a layer of trapped, dead air, a perfect thermal break, preventing the cold earth from draining the warmth of her future wall. This was passive geothermal insulation, a concept the arrogant Mr. Grimes, with all his blueprints, had never bothered to study. Next came the heart of the beast, the firebox. Grimes had mocked her, claiming that smoke would stall in a horizontal maze and suffocate her. He was right about one thing. Smoke needs a draft. But Grimes only understood the massive, wasteful draft of a straight vertical chimney that sucks 80% of a fire's heat directly into the clouds. Anya knew how to manipulate the physics of combustion. Instead of a large, open hearth, she built a narrow, highly insulated burn chamber using her most heat-resistant stones, shaping it like the letter J. By keeping the firebox small and heavily insulated with a mixture of clay and ash, the fire would burn at an incredibly high temperature, consuming not just the wood, but the smoke and wood gases themselves. Above this small burn chamber, she constructed a vertical heat riser, a short, insulated tunnel going straight up. This was her engine. When the intense, concentrated fire burned at the bottom, the superheated gases would shoot up the riser at tremendous speed, creating a powerful vacuum behind them. This vacuum, the thermal siphon, was the invisible force that would drag the smoke through the rest of the system. She did not need to fight gravity. She was using thermodynamics to pull the exhaust exactly where she wanted it to go. Then came the labyrinth. Above the heat riser, Anya began to lay the cracked terracotta pipes horizontally along the wall, connecting them with thick joints of wet clay. She created a serpentine path. The pipe ran horizontally to the right for 6 feet, curved upward, ran horizontally to the left for 6 feet, curved upward again, forming a tight, zigzagging maze that covered the entire back wall of the cabin. This was the mechanism of heat exchange. In a rich man's chimney, 400-degree smoke exits the roof, entirely wasted. In Anya's system, the hot exhaust was forced to travel through 24 feet of horizontal clay piping before it ever reached the outside vent. Every time the hot smoke rubbed against the inner walls of the terracotta, it transferred its kinetic and thermal energy into the material. As the smoke traveled, it cooled, heavy with its heat stripped away, until it finally exited the cabin as merely a wisp of lukewarm vapor. She was stealing every single degree of warmth from the exhaust, but the pipes alone were not enough. The magic of the ancestral design lay in the mass. For 7 grueling days, working from dawn until her hands bled and her muscles screamed, Anya mixed the cob. She poured freezing river water into a pit of blue clay, adding coarse sand for structural strength and dry prairie grass for tensile binding. She mixed it with her bare feet, stomping the freezing mud until it reached the consistency of thick dough. Bucket by agonizing bucket, she hauled this heavy, wet earth into the cabin. She packed it thickly around the terracotta pipes, burying the entire zigzagging labyrinth inside a massive, curved wall of solid earth and fieldstone. She molded it beautifully, smoothing the exterior with a whetstone until it looked like a natural rolling dune rising from her floorboards. She even sculpted a heated bench directly into the side of the wall, a place where little Tobias could sleep directly against the thermal mass. The sheer physical toll was immense. Her fingernails were cracked and black with dirt. Her lips were blue from the ambient cold of the unheated cabin. Down in the town, Vance and his elite circle sat in their plush leather chairs, sipping imported brandy, laughing about the mud hut the orphan girl was building. "She's building a tomb," Grimes had repeated to the syndicate, drawing chuckles from men whose hands had never known the weight of wet stone. They viewed her labor as the pathetic, primitive flailing of the uneducated poor. They did not understand that Anya was not just building a heater, she was building an impenetrable shield. Dense materials like stone and baked clay have profound thermal mass. They take a long time to heat up, but once they absorb thermal energy, they hold on to it with iron-fisted tenacity, releasing it incredibly slowly over hours or even days. Furthermore, the massive cob wall would not emit harsh, dry, convective heat that rises to the ceiling. It would emit radiant heat. Radiant heat travels in invisible electromagnetic waves, moving through the air without heating it, until it strikes a solid object, a wooden chair, the floorboards, or the skin of a freezing child. It is the exact same way the sun warms the earth. It warms the bones. It warms the soul. By the second week of November, the wall was finished. It stood massive, silent, and imposing. 3 tons of earth, stone, and clay, entirely dominating the small cabin. Anya spent the next 2 weeks running tiny, gentle fires in the firebox, not to heat the room, but to slowly bake the moisture out of the clay. The wall cured, turning from a dark, wet brown to a beautiful, bone-dry, golden tan. It became as hard as concrete. The system was ready. It had cost $2.40. It required only a handful of dead twigs and scrap wood to operate. It was a masterpiece of physics, born of desperate poverty and profound ancestral love. And it was finished not a moment too soon, because the sky above the Dakota Territory was turning the color of bruised iron. The birds had vanished. The wind dropped to a dead, terrifying calm. The great white hurricane, a storm that would shatter the arrogance of the elite and test the limits of human endurance, was gathering in the north, preparing to descend upon the town of Oakhaven with an apocalyptic fury. On the 12th of January, the sky above the Dakota Territory did not merely darken, it seemed to solidify. The birds vanished from the skeletal branches, and a dead, terrifying silence fell over the town of Oakhaven. Then, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the horizon fractured. The great white hurricane, a cyclonic bomb of Arctic air, slammed into the valley with the concussive force of a physical blow. Within 4 hours, the temperature plummeted an astonishing 60 degrees, bottoming out at 34 degrees below zero. The wind did not blow. It shrieked like torn metal, driving a blinding horizontal wall of crystalline snow that buried streets, choked chimneys, and instantly froze the rivers solid. Up on the high ridge, where the grand estates stood as monuments to human vanity, the illusion of control shattered almost immediately. Inside the sprawling mansion of Cornelius Vance, the atmosphere was one of rapid kinetic panic. The imported Chicago cast-iron stove, the magnificent $350 beast that was supposed to conquer the winter, was failing. Iron is a phenomenal conductor of heat, but it has absolutely no ability to store it. It requires constant, violent combustion. To keep the massive parlor at a survivable temperature against the howling Arctic draft, the stove demanded 40 pounds of premium anthracite coal every single day. But the railway was dead. A 20-foot snowdrift had derailed the supply train 50 miles south. The town's coal reserves were locked behind frozen, unopenable warehouse doors. Vance, wrapped in 3 layers of tailored Scottish wool, paced the floor with frantic, jerky movements. The pendulum of survival was swinging violently against him. The fire in his iron stove was dwindling, and as the flames shrank, the temperature in the room plummeted by the minute. Because the stove relied entirely on convective heat, heating the weightless air rather than the objects in the room. The moment the fire weakened, the freezing drafts pouring through the window frames instantly swallowed the warmth. Worse still, the iron flue pipe, which vented straight up through the roof, was now acting as a highway for the cold. Without a roaring fire to push the freezing air back up, the sub-zero temperature was creeping down the metal chimney, turning the ornate stove into a block of radiating ice right in the center of his home. "More coal!" Vance screamed at his shivering servants, but there was no coal left. In a state of psychological collapse, Vance, the man who held the mortgages of half the territory, began taking a brass poker to his own imported mahogany dining chairs, shattering them into splintered kindling. He was burning his own wealth, piece by piece, just to buy another hour of life. But hardwood burns fast and aggressive in a wide-open iron box. The heat blasted into the air, rushed straight up the vertical chimney, and vanished into the Arctic night, leaving the bankers shivering violently in the dark. 3 miles down the valley, in a half-buried cabin on the edge of the frozen marsh, the pendulum hung perfectly still. Here, the pacing of life was entirely different. There was no frantic pacing. There was no desperate shattering of furniture. There was only a deep, breathing silence, broken by the gentle ticking of a clock and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a 6-year-old boy. Anya sat in her wooden rocking chair, a patched quilt draped over her lap, reading a book by the light of a single tallow candle. The air inside the cabin was thick, golden, and overwhelmingly warm. The thermometer nailed to the wall held steady at a luxurious 72 degrees. She was, astonishingly, 30 degrees warmer than the wealthiest men in the territory, and she was achieving this with an absolute absence of panic. 4 hours ago, when the storm first hit, Anya had knelt before the small J-shaped firebox of her earthen wall. She did not have coal. She did not have expensive hardwoods. She had a basket of dry pine scraps, pine cones, and twisted dead grass, fuel she had gathered from the forest floor for exactly $0. She loaded a small bundle into the insulated combustion chamber and struck a match. Because the firebox was small and lined with insulating ash, the fire burned with terrifying intensity, reaching temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. It did not smolder. It roared. The superheated gases were instantly sucked up the vertical heat riser by the powerful vacuum she had engineered. Then the magic of the labyrinth began. Instead of escaping through the roof, the searing smoke was forced horizontally through the 24 feet of cracked, zigzagging terracotta pipes buried deep inside the 3-ton mud wall. The heavy earth, cold and dense, aggressively stripped the thermal energy from the smoke. For exactly 60 minutes, the fire raged, and the wall absorbed every degree of that kinetic power. And then, the fire burned out. Anya swept the ashes, closed the small scrap iron door, and walked away. There was no fire burning in her cabin. There would not be another fire for 14 hours. Yet, the immense 3-ton earthen battery was now fully charged. The thermal inertia of the dense cob and river stone had trapped the heat, and it now began its agonizingly slow, beautiful release. It was radiant heat, invisible waves of thermal energy that traveled silently through the room, warming the floorboards, the walls, and the skin of its occupants. Little Tobias slept soundly on the heated cob bench that Anya had sculpted directly into the side of the wall, his fragile lungs breathing easily in the warm, stable air. The Tudex-40 system, built of garbage and mud, was defeating the apocalyptic freeze with the quiet, unstoppable force of geology. By the dawn of the third day, the great white hurricane had not relented. The town of Oakhaven was a frozen tomb. Up on the hill, the psychological collapse of the elite was absolute. The mahogany chairs were gone. The leather-bound books from the library had been incinerated. Mr. Grimes, the arrogant architect who had mocked Anya's understanding of physics, sat huddled in the corner of Vance's parlor, his lips blue, his hands tucked under his armpits. He stared at the dead, freezing iron stove, his mind shattered by the reality of his own engineering failure. He had calculated for combustion, but he had entirely forgotten about retention. He had trusted the brutal force of industry, while a 16-year-old girl in the valley had trusted the quiet memory of the earth. Vance's breath crystallized in the air of his own bedroom. The frost had crept up the inside of his windows, forming thick, opaque sheets of white ice. The air in the mansion was a deadly 28 degrees. They were freezing to death inside a fortress of money. The realization hit Vance with the force of a physical blow. All his gold, all his property deeds, all his power meant absolutely nothing when the world turned to ice. He could not eat his money, and he could not burn it fast enough to stay warm. There was only one option left. They had to abandon the mansions. They had to swallow their immense pride, step out into the blinding white inferno, and seek shelter wherever they could find smoke rising from a chimney. The architects of greed were about to be driven to their knees, forced to march through the deadly snow toward the very valley they had so relentlessly mocked, entirely at the mercy of the girl they had humiliated. The march from the high ridge down into the valley was a procession of ghosts. Cornelius Vance, the man who dictated the financial future of the Dakota Territory, and Mr. Grimes, the architect of its grandest, most inefficient monuments, stumbled through the blinding white out of the great white hurricane. They were no longer masters of the universe. They were fragile, freezing mammals, entirely at the mercy of a world that did not care about their ledgers. Every step through the thigh-deep, crystalline snow was an agonizing negotiation with death. The Arctic wind tore at their imported wool coats, instantly freezing the tears of pure terror on their cheeks. Nature, they were finally learning, does not negotiate with banknotes. Through the howling whiteout, a faint, almost imperceptible shape appeared. It was the roof of Anya's half-buried homesteader cabin. But what caught the desperate, freezing eyes of Mr. Grimes was not the structure itself, but the chimney. There was no violent, black plume of expensive heat rushing uselessly into the sky, like the chimneys of their mansions. There was only a gentle, lukewarm wisp of white vapor quietly dissolving into the wind. The energy had been trapped. The heat was inside. Vance collapsed against the thin wooden door of the cabin, his gloved fists pounding weakly against the timber. He was a man who had never asked for anything in his life. He had only demanded, purchased, or taken. Now he was begging for his life at the threshold of the girl he had told to surrender her brother to an orphanage. The door opened. What spilled out into the sub-zero darkness was not a blast of dry, aggressive air, but a thick, golden wave of radiant, enveloping warmth. It smelled of dry earth, baked clay, and the faint, sweet memory of pine wood. Anya stood in the doorway, a simple woolen shawl over her shoulders, She did not carry the smug, victorious smirk that Vance would have worn if their positions were reversed. The wisdom of the humble does not require malice. She looked at the blue, trembling lips of the most powerful men in the territory, stepped aside, and quietly said, "Come inside before you let the cold in." As Vance and Grimes stumbled across the threshold, their knees buckled, not just from exhaustion, but from the sheer, overwhelming physical shock of the temperature. The cabin was a luxurious, stable 72 degrees. They collapsed onto the floorboards, gasping, their frozen joints slowly thawing in the deep, stable heat. Grimes, shivering violently, crawled across the floor toward the massive golden-brown wall of cob and river stone that spanned the back of the room. He reached out a trembling, frost-bitten hand and pressed it against the earthen surface. It was alive. The wall was radiating a massive, unbroken pulse of thermal energy. It felt like laying a hand on a sun-warmed boulder in the middle of July. Grimes looked frantically around the room, his architectural mind desperate to understand. "Where is the fire?" he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Where is the coal?" "There is no fire, Mr. Grimes," Anya said softly, pouring 2 tin cups of hot water from a kettle that sat on the heated masonry ledge. "I burned a handful of pine scraps 14 hours ago. The fire lasted an hour. The earth remembered the rest." Grimes stared at the $2.40 monument of mud and discarded terracotta pipes. His $350 iron stove, a triumph of modern industrial arrogance, was a block of deadly ice on the hill. Yet here, a 16-year-old girl had manipulated the laws of thermodynamics, capturing the exact same thermal kinetic energy he had allowed to escape into the clouds. She had slowed time. She had stored the sun. He looked over to the heated earthen bench, sculpted directly into the side of the thermal battery. There, little Tobias slept peacefully, a slight flush in his cheeks, his chest rising and falling without a single rattle or cough. The absolute peace of the child shattered whatever pride the engineer had left. Grimes, the man who had laughed at her, who had called her a dangerous fool, buried his face in his frozen hands and began to weep. It was the weeping of a man who realizes his entire worldview was built on a fragile, expensive lie. Cornelius Vance sat on the floor, holding his tin cup of hot water, looking at the girl he had mocked. He had millions of dollars in paper and gold, but in the face of the great white hurricane, all his wealth combined could not buy the 14 hours of radiant, life-saving heat stored in a wall of free dirt. He realized that true poverty is not the absence of money. It is the absence of wisdom. He and his syndicate had tried to dominate nature with brute force and endless spending. Anya had survived by submitting to nature, by studying its flow, and by building a partnership with the elements. The storm raged for 3 more days, burying the town of Oakhaven in an icy tomb. But inside the humble cabin, the pendulum of survival remained perfectly, beautifully still. The bankers survived, entirely sustained by the charity and the engineering of the orphan girl. When the spring finally broke, melting the snow and unfreezing the railway lines, Vance and Grimes returned to the hill. They were changed men. They never spoke of the iron stoves again. The legend of the girl who piped smoke through her walls and conquered the winter quietly spread across the territory, a permanent reminder that the most sophisticated technology on Earth is often the dirt beneath our feet. We live in an era that worships the complex, the expensive, and the artificial. We are taught to be consumers of warmth, reliant on fragile grids and spiraling bills, forgetting that our ancestors survived ice ages with nothing but stone, earth, and profound observation. Anya's story is not just history. It is a blueprint for true independence. It is a reminder that you do not need the permission of the elite to build your own sanctuary. If this story ignited a fire within you, if you believe that the old ways still hold the power to save us, and that true wealth is measured in knowledge, not in currency, do not let this hearth go cold. Subscribe to our channel. Leave a like to feed the algorithm so this forgotten wisdom can reach those who need it most. Share this video with someone who understands the value of resilience. And before you go, tell me in the comments below, from which city are you watching this? Where in the world is the resistance of ancestral knowledge still burning bright? I am the storyteller of the Austral legacy. Until our next fire, keep your mind sharp, keep your hands in the earth, and never forget that the most powerful force against the winter of arrogance is the quiet, enduring warmth of humility.